Thank you. Thank you very much. I want today to focus on the situation of the refugees in Camp Liberty. You know, many people in Europe, people around the world wonder why the United Nations is so unpopular in the United States. I'm going to explain why, using Camp Liberty and the treatment of the Iranian refugees in Iraq as a case study, an almost scientific case study in how the UN does things wrong. What we're seeing now with respect to the treatment of the people at Camp Liberty is a systemic failure of the United Nations, its entire system. The UN assistance mission in Iraq acts as though it's a paid agent of the al-Maliki government in Baghdad. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the Undersecretary General for Coordinating Humanitarian Assistance in New York are failing to uphold their mandates. And the UN system as a whole is once again being thoroughly discredited. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, someone I've known personally for over 20 years, I think is not fully informed about what's happening, but in any event, he is making a huge mistake on his own behalf and behalf of the UN if he doesn't correct matters instantly. But first and foremost, the High Commissioner here in Geneva has to stand up for his own mandate. And the UN member states and the non-governmental organizations who do humanitarian work around the world have to wake up to what's happening, and fast. Now let me run through some important points here that seem to get lost in the debate. First, the Secretary General's Special Representative for UNAMI is not the czar of the UN system in Iraq. And in fact, the Security Council of the UN has repeatedly recognized that the role of the High Commissioner for Refugees in Iraq is not subordinate to Martin Kobler or UNAMI. In the most recent reauthorization of UNAMI in Resolution 2061 of July of last year, in preambular paragraph 12, I just want to say this so everybody knows where to find it, the Security Council said specifically that it endorsed the important role of the High Commissioner for Refugees in coordination with UNAMI on these issues, not under UNAMI's direction, in coordination with UNAMI. Kobler is suffering from what in the U.S. State Department we call clientitis. He thinks he works not for the United Nations and its member governments, but for the government of Iraq. And I think his position at this point is simply hopeless. That's why within the UN system we need the High Commissioner and we need the Undersecretary General for Coordinating Humanitarian Assistance to assert themselves. Now let's look at the role of the High Commissioner. There are essentially two mandates that it's had since the office was created: protection and assistance. And these two mandates are demonstrated by UNHCR's own seal, the seal that on the flag that it flies and the correspondence that it sends all around the world. The familiar signal of the two hands providing walls around and a roof over a refugee. These are the symbols of protection and assistance. And how cruel the tragedy in February was that shows that the UN High Commissioner's own seal is not being upheld. He's not providing protection. He's not providing assistance. These mandates and this responsibility go back to the creation of the High Commissioner and to its non-political work. The statute of the Office of the High Commissioner says specifically, the work of the High Commissioner shall be of an entirely non-political character. It should be humanitarian and social. And what Martin Kobler has done and what the High Commissioner's office has permitted to happen is that its role is being politicized. It is following the will of the al-Maliki government, which is following the will of the mullahs in Tehran. If there were ever a group of people who could demonstrate, in the original words of the High Commissioner's statute, a well-founded fear of persecution, it is obviously the residents of Camp Liberty. And the government of Iraq has contributed to this in many respects. You know, the resolution of the General Assembly that created the Office of the High Commissioner called on all UN member governments, whether they adhere to any of the refugee conventions or not, to do things like providing refugees with travel and other documents, such as would normally be provided to other aliens by their national authorities, especially documents which would facilitate their resettlement. And it also says that governments should permit refugees to transfer their assets, and especially those necessary for resettlement. I could go on because it's a long list. It's like the al-Maliki regime read the resolution in 1950 creating UNHCR and decided to see how many of its provisions it could ignore and contravene. This is what the High Commissioner is supposed to stand against. Now, there's a lot of talk about the Memorandum of Understanding that Martin Kobler negotiated, but let's be clear. No UN bureaucrat can compromise the mandate of the High Commissioner. The High Commissioner's mandate flows from the member governments. Martin Kobler works for the member governments, not the other way around. That's a point many UN officials have to hear over and over again. But the High Commissioner's mandate, which he should assert, comes directly from the member governments. Now, the current High Commissioner, Antonio Guterres, I am afraid, is on the verge of bringing the High Commissioner's office to its lowest repute since 1989. Not just financial impropriety, he's not defending his own mandate. And yet, the High Commissioner's own report, referring to Camp Liberty, says UNHCR will need to significantly augment the human and financial resources allocated to the task in 2013. Why? They're not doing anything. What do they need the money for? But this is exactly the point that has to be brought to bear in the High Commissioner's office, that major donors that fund UNHCR expect that it will comply with its mandate. This is exactly the kind of situation that was contemplated when UNHCR was provided. Refugees from a government that would persecute them if they returned, and taking first asylum in a country that doesn't want to have anything to do with them. That's what the role of the UNHCR is intended to be. But the UN has other agencies as well. The Undersecretary General in the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance in New York. Again, I was in the Bush administration in 1991 when the United States led the way to create this office. I must say, if we thought this was what we were going to get, we wouldn't have created it to begin with. Where is Valerie Amos? Why isn't she standing up for the refugees in Liberty? And indeed, this whole thing is compounded by the utter ingratitude of the government of Iraq. Where is Antonio Guterres' courage? Now, one might ask, well, who should care about this other than the refugees at Camp Liberty? And the fact is, all UN member states, and especially the large contributing countries, have to worry when the High Commissioner for Refugees does not fulfill his mandate. And again, I ask you, wonder why the UN is so unpopular in the United States. This is the kind of reason why. And so, too, the non-governmental organizations, so many of which are present here in Geneva, that carry out important work all around the world. You think this failure by the High Commissioner doesn't affect you? You say just because your work doesn't involve political matters, that you don't work in the Middle East, or you don't deal specifically with refugee issues. Let me tell you, when the UN's humanitarian agencies fail, it affects every non-governmental organization dealing in international issues. And both for the member states and for the non-governmental organizations, I just give you John Donne's words from his meditations. And therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. This story of the failure of the High Commissioner at Liberty is a story that affects everyone around the world. So what is to be done, in Vladimir Lenin's words, to get the attention of some people here in Geneva? What is to be done? The first thing is that the UNHCR has to get up off his posterior and challenge Martin Kobler. He needs to challenge him within the UN system. He needs to challenge him publicly. Member governments will support a High Commissioner who vigorously defends his mandate. And Valerie Amos, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs in New York, needs to second the High Commissioner's work. The member governments, all of whom are now watching the Human Rights Council meeting in Geneva, need to see and understand the danger to the humanitarian system that's present with the maltreatment of the refugees at Camp Liberty. And so, too, as I say, the non-governmental organizations have to protest the politicization of the work of the humanitarian agencies the way Martin Kobler has done it. This is a critical issue, not just for the suffering people of Camp Liberty, but for humanitarian issues all around the world. There is a huge precedent being set here to the detriment of the refugees and to the detriment of the United Nations system, and all of us need to work to correct that. Thank you very much.